One of the most traumatic events for the United States during the entirety of the Cold War was the war in Vietnam. It consumed vast amounts of energy, treasure, and especially blood from all sides, with death tolls well into the millions. And ultimately, it was a defeat for the United States, a war that helped divide a superpower, one that marked an end to the post-war idea that the United States had the power to enact its will around the world. But what Americans think of as the Vietnam War was really the second part of a longer conflict, where Washington had merely picked up the baton that Paris had put down after their own defeat in Southeast Asia. I'm your host David, and today we are going to start our long look at the decades-long wars in Southeast Asia that ravaged the region and that was shaped by and helped to shape the Cold War. So to really start the story, we are going back over 1,000 years to CE 968 and the establishment of the Kingdom of Dai Viet in the region of modern-day Hanoi. Dai Viet existed in various forms over the next almost 1,000 years, under multiple dynasties. Dai Viet slowly expanded southward along the coast over this time period, gradually taking over the land from the Cham and Khmer empires. Dai Viet was independent of China to the north, but regular tribute was provided to its influential neighbor. Division of Dai Viet was a common feature, especially from the 16th century until the early 1800s, when the Nguyen dynasty united all the territory and first used the name Vietnam. A long, stretched-out country, the geography of Vietnam was highly influential in its cultural development. Keep in mind that Hanoi, in the Red River Delta in the north, is 1,137 kilometers as the crow flies, but due to the terrain is today a 1,757 kilometer drive to Ho Chi Minh City in the south. Keep in mind that we will be using the name Saigon for much of this series, as that was the name used at the time, and it is likely easier when working with sources. So that distance is a vast gulf, even in the present day, but before the development of mechanized transport, it could almost be considered worlds apart. All that being said, it's no surprise then that the North and the South developed somewhat differently from each other. The North was often described as more conservative and hierarchical in nature, a result of the Confucian education system used to govern, while the South, with more economic opportunity available due to the expansion of Dai Viet, had a reputation as being more individualistic and entrepreneurial, and where economic success was linked to social status. These are general characteristics, of course, and paint with a very broad brush, but they help to contextualize what was to develop in the 20th century. So that was the situation, described very briefly for 1,000 years. And then, in the 1860s, the French showed up with their berets and croissants and colonialism. To be fair, the French had first shown up in Indochina in the 1700s, largely as part of an effort to proselytize Catholicism, but it wasn't until the 1850s that a new mission emerged: protecting those Catholics. Or that was the excuse anyway. In reality, the French were motivated to gain colonial territory in Asia for fear of falling behind their British rivals. Southeast Asia wasn't necessarily the most attractive initial region, but it held a strategic position between India and Malaya, and its proximity to China made it an enticing target for French ambitions. Vietnam was split into 3 administrative units: Cochin China in the south, Annam in the middle, and Tonkin in the north. By 1893, both Cambodia and Laos had also fallen under French colonial control, with the formation of the French Indo-Chinese Union. Crucially, but also something that shouldn't come as a surprise, how the French ruled was key for what was to come. Cochin China, with its easier riches, was seen as more valuable to the French and was placed under direct French colonial administration. The Vietnamese in the south, as a result, became more westernized, seen as necessary to gain an advantage. By working for the colonial administration or for the plantations, a small middle class began to emerge. Education in French was sought after as it could open new opportunities for advancement. In Annam and Tonkin, by contrast, a more hands-off approach was taken by the French, who ruled there indirectly, using loyal Vietnamese elites to administer and govern. Economic and social opportunities were more limited than in the South, as the traditional elites maintained a tighter control on power. However, at the end of the day, even these northern elites were restricted by the whims of the French authorities. Under French colonial rule, a small but privileged elite emerged, benefiting from working for and with the colonial regime. These privileges, both economic but also social, came at the expense of the previous elite who felt left behind as Indochina changed. Like is so often the case, these former elites began to look for ways to restore their position by removing their colonial masters. The peasantry, who had a long and deep attachment to their ancestral lands, began to be separated from it, as the French developed an extractive economic model based on the creation of plantations for the growing of commodities such as rice, rubber, and coffee. As the French imposed a greater tax burden on the already often subsistence farmers in Annam and Tonkin, many peasants were forced into borrowing money to pay owed taxes, and in many cases were forced off their lands as they were bought up by speculators. These peasants often ended up working as laborers on the plantations, usually for meager wages. A growing group of poor with no attachment to the land was beginning to form. Now, this separation from the land didn't play a huge role in the development of a nationalist idea, but it was to prove key for the events that were to dominate the 20th century. Vietnamese nationalism began to emerge as a concept in the early 1900s. It started among the small middle class that had established itself and was led by thinkers like Phan Boi Chan and Phan Chu Trinh. There had long been a strong sense of being not Chinese, a product of proximity and centuries of domination, but it was Phan Boi Chan and Phan Chu Trinh that worked to develop a more positive concept of what being Vietnamese was, as opposed to what it was not. This idea, put forward by historians like Edward Miller, runs in opposition to a more traditional view that being distinctly Vietnamese as a national concept was centuries old. Keep in mind, the first non-court Chinese histories of Vietnam were written by the French in the 19th century, and it wasn't until 1906 that the first true Vietnamese history of Vietnam emerged, Hoang Dao Than's complete compilation of the new convention of Viet history. All this to say, really, that the concept of Vietnamese nationalism that leaders like Ho Chi Minh would call on by the 1930s and beyond was not one deeply rooted in tradition, but itself an interpretation of more recent ideas. Of course, we should point out that anyone who received an education in French was receiving a French education. This was the period of the Third Republic, and the ideas of the French revolutionary spirit of liberté, égalité, and fraternité were very much being promoted, even in the colonies. These were the same ideals, however, that were very much not in practice in colonial Indochina. Vietnamese participation in the First World War increased expectation of some sort of reward or recognition. With between 100 and 150,000 Vietnamese traveling to France to take on roles as laborers and in industry, there was some reason to expect something, but nothing was forthcoming. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, a young French-educated Vietnamese man, then under the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, himself steeped in the emerging politics of Vietnamese nationalism, attempted to petition directly to French President Georges Clemenceau and US President Woodrow Wilson consideration for a decolonized Vietnam based on Wilson's own 14 points. The young man, who would later change his name again to Ho Chi Minh, was ignored, but the incident not only reflects growing Vietnamese awareness of their own identity, but also attitudes in the West towards colonial subjects. Wilsonian thought only applied to Europeans. Quoc, who had been willing to work within the system to attain Vietnamese independence, began to turn away from the ideas of Western liberalism and instead found the works of Karl Marx, but especially Vladimir Lenin, and his work specifically on anti-colonialism. Quoc was so taken by these ideas, he quickly immersed himself in the teachings and writings of the socialist world, and in 1920 helped to found the French Communist Party, becoming the voice of the party on colonial affairs. By 1923, Quoc had relocated to Moscow, where he spent a year. His time in Moscow was difficult as Lenin was nearing death and men like Stalin had little interest in places like Indochina, which not only lacked the industrial base deemed necessary for socialism, but Stalin also didn't trust Quoc as Stalin felt he was too much of a nationalist and too little a communist. The next year, in 1924, Quoc was assigned to Guangzhou province in China to work with the Comintern, promoting socialist thought. The real reason for the posting, however, was to secretly begin organizing a communist party from the Vietnamese exiles residing there. When Chiang Kai-shek broke with the communists in China in 1927, Kwok was forced to abandon Guangzhou, first returning to Moscow, then moving on to Paris, and then returning to Asia by way of Thailand, then Shanghai, and eventually ending up in Hong Kong. It was there in 1930 that he helped form the Communist Party of Vietnam, as well as the Indochinese Communist Party, the ICP. Please don't confuse this with the insane clown posse, whoop whoop. Now, we do need to consider that Kwok and the Communists were by no means the only people advocating for an independent Vietnam. Other nationalist groups had formed as it became more and more apparent that France had no desire to let go of control in Indochina. Formed in 1927, the Vietnam QuocDan Dang, the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, was among the most prominent of these groups, but a failed uprising using Vietnamese colonial troops in 1930 resulted in their leadership being captured or killed, and while the VNQDD remained active, it failed to gain more widespread traction and support. This left the communists as the dominant organized political force. But like so many communist movements, factionalism was a thing. A series of communist revolts sponsored by the Vietnamese Communist Party in Ninh An and Ha Tinh provinces through 1930 and 1931, which were suppressed by French colonial forces, resulted in up to 90% of the leadership of the VCP being arrested and or executed. Each of these revolts left the ICP specifically as the most coherent and organized anti-colonial movement in Indochina. Global events certainly played a role in the development of the ICP. French anti-communism began to soften from the mid-1930s as the threat of fascism increased, giving more breathing room for the party to continue to organize and grow. Additionally, the relationship to Moscow was changing as the Soviet class war orthodoxy of the late 1920s and early 1930s began to give way to more pragmatic dealings, allowing nationalist forms of communism to play a larger role, again in light of the threat of fascism. This allowed Kwok, who had been sidelined through the Orthodox period and was living in China again, to re-emerge as a party leader. But even with this, there was still little opportunity for the ICP to initiate any real change. Change was, however, forced in 1940 when Germany defeated France and the Vichy Republic was established. Indochina remained loyal to Vichy rather than joining the Free French under de Gaulle. Japan, an Axis ally of Germany and therefore by extension on the same side-ish as Vichy France, looked to solve an ongoing thorn in their side. The Americans at this point were supplying up to 48% of all aid to nationalist Chinese forces through the port of Haiphong, which was then sent by rail to Kunming. Under an agreement with Vichy officials, Japan was permitted to station troops in Tonkin, but in order to minimize their own exposure, allowed the French to continue to administer the territory. In July of 1941, the Japanese imposed a change to the agreement that permitted the stationing of Japanese troops in both Annam and Cochin China. In one of those twists of history, it was this southern expansion that triggered the United States to impose the oil embargo on Japan, which accelerated Tokyo's war plans and led to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Unintended consequences and all of that. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to understand that the ICP organization was not exactly a unified organization. This was the result of some internal ideological divisions, but this was highly magnified by geographical distances, which made coordination and sometimes even basic communication all but impossible between different groups across Indochina. Members of the ICP in Cochin China viewed the Japanese stationing of troops in Tonkin as a sign of French weakness and launched an uprising that was swiftly crushed. This event had several repercussions. The first was that the decision by the ICP in Tonkin to withdraw into the hills instead of trying to fight. The second was that the ICP was really only left with any leadership in the north, allowing them to plan and develop how the party would move forward. Based on this, Kwok made the decision that he would return to Vietnam, the first time in 30 years. He crossed from China into Cao Bang province in order to oversee a plenary session of the Central Committee. Not only was it around this time that he changed his name again from Nguyen Ai Quoc to Ho Chi Minh, but a decision was made to subsume the ICP into a broad front coalition that would represent Vietnamese nationalism rather than focus on class warfare. This new organization was the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Min Hoi, most often referred to as simply the Viet Minh. Conveniently for Ho, while the Viet Minh was a broad front coalition, it was very much dominated by elements of the ICP. So the decision to subsume the ICP into the Viet Minh was controversial at the time, but Ho and those around him realized that the cause for an independent Vietnam was not something they could achieve on their own. Previous uprisings had all been crushed, and the need for widespread support was understood to be critical. The Viet Minh, with its stresses on nationalism rather than class and communism, was seen as a way to gain support for the nationalist cause, but also for the ICP itself. The Viet Minh went to work organizing and expanding, creating a network of cadres across Vietnam with good success, especially in Tonkin. As you might expect, occupied Indochina saw some significant changes. For one, between 1940 and 1945, the Indochinese economy was forced to quickly reorient itself, pulling away from exporting to France, with extracted resources of the region being sent to Japan instead. This broke the decades-old connections that had existed. Ironically, for what was to come, the French still in Indochina began to promote Vietnamese nationalism as a way to offset the Japanese. Governor-General Decoux, appointed by General Pétain's Vichy government, became the first French Governor-General to make reference to Vietnam as opposed to Indochina or Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China. And finally, although it is somewhat difficult to quantify this factor, the Vietnamese people themselves were witness to the Japanese putting captured POWs, Americans and Commonwealth soldiers mostly, to work performing manual labor. The French authorities lodged objections and were ignored by the Japanese authorities, and as a result, the Vietnamese population got to watch white Europeans doing work that had always been deemed beneath them, while there were Asians that could do it for them. There's a psychological factor there which the French themselves feared, a genie that could never be put back in its bottle. While Ho and the Viet Minh worked against the Japanese and the French, the topic of Indochina was a recurring one in the halls of Western allies. Charles de Gaulle had emerged as the leader of the Free French, and he was a strong advocate for the post-war restoration of the French Empire, including Indochina. He found an unlikely ally in Winston Churchill, who, despite his personal feelings towards de Gaulle, was supportive, as Great Britain was concerned about keeping its own colonies in the post-war period, and didn't want any precedent being set that could be subsequently used against London. FDR, however, had no keen interest in the maintenance of the French Empire, but was also not interested in the wholly independent Indochina, instead favoring a trusteeship model similar in line to the mandate system imposed on the former Ottoman territories in the Middle East following the First World War. Stalin also expressed interest in the trusteeship model, although it wasn't because of interest in Indochina so much as ensuring that the French metropole was as weak as possible in the post-war period. In March of 1945, as the war continued to get worse and worse for the Japanese, they made the decision to assume full control over all of Indochina. French administrators, as well as security services, including the army, were swiftly removed and replaced. The Japanese also forced the Vietnamese puppet emperor, Bao Dai, to declare Vietnamese independence. The Japanese decision was largely driven by the assumption that US forces were planning an invasion of Indochina. The Americans had been conducting bombing raids on Indochinese infrastructure, and a large-scale carrier raid in January of 1945 reinforced this idea to the Japanese. In preparation for this expected invasion, they pooled most of their forces into the south, leaving Tonkin with few Japanese troops. For the citizenry of Indochina, seeing the French replaced so easily was revelatory and delegitimizing. In the words of Fredrik Logevall, quote, "Colonial rule had been based on the notion of European cultural and military supremacy, and though France had offered little more than token resistance to Japan in 1940, only now did most Vietnamese fully grasp how hollow was the French basis of power." The combination of the removal of both French and Japanese forces left only one group with sufficient organization and manpower to step into the vacuum, the Viet Minh. This happened to coincide with a massive famine in Annam, but especially in Tonkin. The combination of wartime requisitioning, of massive infrastructure damage due to the war, and bad weather devastated the first rice harvest of 1945. This was then magnified by the inability to move rice from Cochin China to the north due to the damaged road and rail networks. The result was the deaths of 1 million Vietnamese in Tonkin and a further 300,000 in Annam. These figures are somewhat disputed, with the original French numbers put at 100,000 and later Vietnamese sources claiming as many as 2 million, but 1 million seems to be the consensus historical death toll. The peasantry put the blame on the French, the Japanese, and the collaborationist Vietnamese government of Bao Dai. The only group that stepped in and tried to provide relief was the, well, yeah, you guessed it, the Viet Minh, who gained a great deal of support and sympathy as a result of their efforts. Internationally, by the time of FDR's death in April of 1945, no clear consensus had been reached on how Indochina should be administered when the end of the war was reached. This left Truman, a man with little international experience, to make his own decisions. His strong anti-communist focus, with little grounding in Wilsonian ideas of self-determination, led him to the conclusion that the most important outcome was to ensure a strong anti-Soviet bloc in Europe, which meant that for Truman and the United States, they would back France in reclaiming and maintaining her colonies. At Potsdam, where the French weren't even invited to partake in the new global reordering, the Big Three agreed that the southern portion of Vietnam would be occupied by British forces, while the northern portion, split at the 16th parallel, would be occupied by Chinese forces under Chiang Kai-shek. This would be to secure the territory from the Japanese forces there, pending the arrival of a French reoccupation force. This was, however, largely unknown to the Vietnamese, who continued to pin their hopes for independence on the Americans. The Japanese surrender in August of 1945 caught everybody by surprise, but the Viet Minh were the ones poised to be able to capitalize on the suddenness. The French force meant to reoccupy the colony was nowhere near ready, and neither the British or Chinese forces, designated by the Potsdam Agreement, were in position either. Despite having little physical strength in urban areas, the Viet Minh quickly moved to take control of Hanoi, Hue, and Saigon, and did so with little opposition from the newly defeated Japanese. The Viet Minh had been preparing to engage in a general insurrection alongside invading Allied troops, expected to be American, but the evaporation of Japanese power allowed for an easy pivot. On September 2, 1945, having only entered the city on August 26 for the first time in his life, Ho Chi Minh addressed a huge crowd in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi. Quote, "We hold truths that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Along with this invocation of the American Declaration of Independence, Ho proclaimed the birth of an independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The stage was now set for the next 25 years of war that was to ravage Southeast Asia, resulting in the deaths of millions. This episode, the first part of many to come as we look at this conflict, is designed to give a background explanation of the situation on the eve of war. We hope to give explanations and reasons for why specific actions took place, why certain decisions were made or not made, possibly dispel some myths, and generally give those of you interested a framework of understanding of the wars in Southeast Asia, one of the key battlegrounds of the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is studying Leninism in order to glean the secret of creating a national revolution. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.